told some of you this, but I sent my title of this talk to D'Angela in early January, like January 9th or something. And then I was very pleased with myself. I was like, this is a great title. Like, good job, Robert. And then I don't know, a month later, I see very special guest, Jill Jones. I was like, oh, damn. Because, Jill's the lady cab driver. We all know that. I wasn't going to be like, guess who it actually is? And then Jill did a great Prince Twitter thread about Lady Cab Driver, which if you have not read that, I hope that you will. I have a screenshot of part of it. And so, I was thinking, like, what am I going to tell people? Like, what in the hell am I going to do? But it reminded me that don't forget that music makes room for the listener to imagine. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here today. I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you to D'Angela. Thank you to everyone that I've met for the first time in person or haven't seen maybe since 2018 at Prince from Minneapolis. And I'm just really just humbled to be part of this. It's a tremendous honor to be here. And to also follow Zaire, which is like another oh, and by the way, you're going to follow Zaire. Okay, great. So I so I also write fiction. I'm a songwriter too. I've played music since I was 10. Writing characters in a song is very different from writing them in a novel or short story. Even when the character is fairly well defined, the song, like a poem, still uses suggestion, implications, intuitions, and even what's not said to create a sense of the persona. So because there are voices, though, in songs, of course, we make certain assumptions and we start assigning meaning based on the actuality, on the non-fictional actuality that we know. For instance, on 1999, when you hear the two women who sound like one voice speaking, to me they always do. I thought that was double-tracked. You don't ask who are these fictional characters necessarily. You wonder who are these two women. And if you happen to be, I don't know, let's say seeing the video a little later than it came out, maybe not real time, real time. Say I don't know, in 1985, your divorced father's girlfriend's apartment where they've got MTV, and you're like, oh shit, MTV, great. And you see this for the first time, and you think, okay, well, who's the woman in the pilot's hat? And who's the woman teaching her how to play the piano in this particular fashion? And where can I find more of this, right? And so, Jill has blessed us both here on Twitter and then here this weekend with the actuality behind the song "Lady Cab Driver." And did most of you hear that? Do I need to repeat the story? Do you want me to? Just real quick, it's that Jill is in LA having met Prince on the Controversy tour by working with Tina Marie. Prince shows up in LA in spring 1982, asks Jill to hang out. He's driving a BMW, is that right? Did I remember that? Okay. And so she ends up driving him around. She becomes the lady cab driver just by driving not a taxi cab, thank God, but a BMW, right? And so he writes this song, and yes, it's definitely reusing and changing a little bit, rearrange. Which to me, when I heard it on the box set, it sounds actually because it's right next to Bold Generation, which of course becomes New Power Generation, right? I feel like those two songs actually go together really well. And so when I hear Lady Cab Driver, it feels very different, right? It's much more sort of melancholy and low energy, sort of. In a good way. And so he asked Jill to perform on it. July 7, 1982 is the date I have from Prince Vault, which is the Bible, that in Dwayne's books. And it's the first thing that she records, including that part of the song, right? Again, I don't want to go over the whole story again with you, but I do want to emphasize how young these people were, right? Prince had just turned 24, and Jill, if I've got your birthday, is it right on Wikipedia? July 11th? Okay, so you had just turned 20 when you recorded that song. Or you were about to, yes. So So what I want to impress upon you is that here are these young people who are learning to navigate some tricky territory, which is the actual and the imagined. And as writers and musicians especially, they worked at this intersection, and I'm sorry, this is like I put this together today, so I'm sorry, this is not always a great PowerPoint. As writers and musicians especially, they worked at the intersection of these two things, at the places where they overlap. And that can actually get very, it can get dangerous, right? Like in a like person-to-person interpersonal way, there's a lot at stake. There can be misunderstandings, there can be all sorts of issues that come up. It's part of the business, I think, of working collaboratively with people in an artistic setting. So what I want to do, though, today is to sort of broadly think through this tension between actuality and imagination, and basically think about three categories, which are art, identity, and politics. And when I say identity, what I mean is identity versus self, that sort of conflict that I'll get into a little bit more, but some of you might know where I'm going with that. So basically, I want to reflect on the character of the lady cab driver as a character, right, in the imaginary, in order to get at the question of 1999, its story world, and if we can coin this kind of term, its working-class-ness. We had not talked about our two presentations, but so much of what Zaire talked about sort of feeds directly into what I'm talking about, and I'm really grateful for that and also terrified. But as many of you know, for a while I've been trying to understand Prince and the Black American working class, along with the constant evolution of Prince's class consciousness. There's a journey that he was on, for sure. And so, you can think of it as like him using labor sort of mantras and sexuality, all the way, of course, to his critiques of the music industry in the 1990s and 2000s. At all times, there's a tension between the way things are and the way things could be. And the could be is incredibly important. And this is where I think art and politics do meet. I would argue that 1999 is a protest song, and that we can easily read Lady Cab Driver as at least having a political dimension, which I'll get into here in a little bit. So basically my question is, where does 1999 fit in on this journey? And it's still pretty early in the journey, right? So in terms of identities and the self, this is where I want to tie together a couple concepts that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with, and I'm going to tie them together in a very quick fashion. First of all is intersectionality, right? So we're looking at the intersections of gender and race with socioeconomic class, which means we're looking at the critical race theory scholar Kimberly Crenshaw's definition of intersectionality, and it's up there if you want to take a look. Not primarily about identity, but how structures make certain identities the consequence of and the vehicle for vulnerability. That's a word that's come up a lot at this symposium too, right? Vulnerability is a word that I feel like is in our culture right now in a lot of different ways with a lot of different meanings. And there's a lot to unpack, as always, with that, right? But so, for instance, yesterday we heard about girl groups carrying the burden of morality and enforced gender codes. They didn't make up those codes, right? They sort of are inheriting them as a consequence of their vulnerability as young black women in a white supremacist society, and that they had to struggle with those certain identities that were sort of given to them: good girl, bad girl, nasty girl. True identity, which I think of as the self, and actually in that interview about Afrofuturism, Samuel Delaney makes this exact point, which is that it's the realm of the multidimensional and ineffable, right? That there's these things that we can't completely explain. Nothing can be boiled down to something so marketable as an identity or a brand. Students where I work at Columbus College of Art and Design, they're always talking about their brand, and I do not like that term. And I talk with them about it for multiple reasons. There is a kind of social discipline that happens in right now. I'm still thinking of gender and sexuality, and this reminds me of queer theorist and philosopher Judith Butler and her classic rebuke of readers who mistook her theory of gender performance as being essentially all fun and games. She said performativity has to do with repetition. Very often the repetition of oppressive and painful gender norms. This is not freedom, but a question of how to work the trap that one is inevitably in. So a moment ago I said structures, and after that I said the trap that one is inevitably in. And by structures, Crenshaw means like literal like institutions, but not like necessarily the buildings. And Butler means social and cultural mechanics of discipline and punishment, which is sort of where this Foucault stuff comes from. Or she's getting that from Foucault, I should say. But because I'm this kind of like literalist idiot, I'm thinking like, what about buildings, right? And turns out that's not so dumb after all, right? Because you need to be thinking about access to and traversing through spaces as a matter of social justice. And it is absolutely a matter that is something that is thought about with intersectionality. And it makes me think of, I don't know why, this painting. So I want to give you this kind of visual metaphor that you can kind of work with as I go through the rest of this presentation. This is a painting by Dutch painter Piet Mondrian. It's called Broadway Boogie Woogie, which you can actually see at MoMA. Mondrian was inspired, it's from 1942. Mondrian was inspired by Manhattan's rigid grid layout, but also by boogie woogie, the genre of blues music where the left hand is always rolling. But when I see this painting, I see circuitry and I see a prison. I see a structure with certain rules. And I was thinking about all this stuff, and I saw it as a kind of metaphor for white privilege, right? That imagine if I told you that that we were all going to get from the red and gray square up here in the top corner, and we all were going to have to get down to the blue square down sort of near the bottom right, right? As a white, cis, straight male who's roughly middle class, I wouldn't have too many roadblocks, right? But you can imagine that for people who are non-white, for black and brown folks, for people with disabilities, for people with all kinds of other intersectional attributes, including gender and sexuality, that each of those little blocks represents a kind of a sort of checkpoint, an obstacle, a problem, right? A cost that has to be paid. Some sort of thing that keeps you from just easily moving through. And, you know, being in New York certainly has gotten me thinking about it, but New York's not the only, I mean, he was clearly thinking the subway, but New York is absolutely not the only place that this is an issue. And so, you know, this got me thinking, this represents, for me, the sort of the madness of our contemporary situation, and frankly, this sort of weird thing that white supremacy sort of achieves. I wanted to watch the time. Can you just give me like a sign when I'm like at 5? Okay, so the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore. If you don't know her, I highly recommend reading her work. To me, this problem represents what she calls a carceral geography, as in terms of incarceration. And for her, although the main destination is prisons, that's what she's most known for, as being a anti-prison activist, we've got to see the whole system. In other words, we have to see all the mechanisms that push a so-called surplus population in the eyes of racial capitalism toward carceral facilities. And this carceral geography is precisely what the United States has always been founded on due to white supremacy, and it's what was being re-energized due to the 1980 election, of course, of Ronald Reagan when Prince was making 1999. Like Trump, Reagan was a symptom of a pernicious conjuncture of economic and cultural forces, and was, for example, there was already neoliberal ideology that was sort of pushing the sort of change in capitalism, and in particular the deindustrialization of the United States. Why does that matter? Because all of the jobs, manufacturing jobs especially, were leaving the United States, going overseas, and that greatly affected the black working class, particularly in the cities, in both North and South. There was also the rolling back of the so-called social, of the safety net of the so-called welfare state, which was seen as having been, as making the U.S. soft. How much? 3? Okay. As having made the U.S. soft. So this, to me, is what I want to sort of get at here, is that this is the world of 1999. And it's sort of, I hope that can sort of like be right alongside with what Zaire was talking about, because I think what Prince has always done with his characters and the worlds that he creates, he always was, especially at this period, he's always creating the utopia world. But I think he also always has an eye on the realistic world around him. And I think 1999 is no exception. To me, it's sort of interesting that, here, I'm going to have to skip forward just a little bit here. To me, it's interesting that so much depends on this character. For me, is my reading of this album, somebody that we don't really know. We don't really know who the lady cab driver is, because she doesn't get to speak for herself aside from the orgasmic vocalizations, right? She doubles the words of Prince's character, and she has this vocal track that is really, I think, really subtle, which is amazing considering that it was recorded all on one microphone. And I know that this portion of the song is intentionally absurd, right? The sort of the sexual encounter. It's kind of a scene, from the letter section of Penthouse Forum or something. But it's still, to me, it bothers me that she doesn't get to speak. So I do think that when we encounter that situation, we do start to fill in gaps, or at least some of us do. Some of us who tend to just be thinking about those sorts of things, and I think that's actually pretty common. And so to me, she is a woman who's working in a man's industry. And the overwhelming number of taxi drivers are male, and so in the same sense, she's a rarity, like the woman in Little Red Corvette, but she's in this service job, and a service industry employee always faces so much more, as many of you know, so much more just shit from people, right? She has to put up with all this kind of stuff, and I think Prince catches on to the strange confessional nature of the taxi cab. And I don't know if it's because of the plexiglass window or just having this driver, but for whatever reason, the working class taxi driver is always sort of like the bartender, this confidant, right? This person you go to talk to. But of course, it's different if it's a woman. And this is an example of intersectional vulnerability. And what's sad to me is that Prince's character should be in solidarity with the lady cab driver. And maybe the song's supposed to imply that he is. He recognizes that she's driving this cab that she has to drive for no money at all. But he's the one with no money, so what the hell, right? I mean, he's not helping out. So in the end, I start to imagine that the lady cab driver, and I'll leave you with this, lady cab driver is living precariously, subject to the whims of economic and political forces greater than her. Not unlike Prince's persona, many of them the persona on the album. But like others who belong to vulnerable populations and live in carceral territories, she's trying to navigate a space and seek shelter in a terrain that is dangerous. However, let me push the fictionalizing forward just a little bit and bring up the good news, which is also from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, which is Abolition Geography. And in this case, Abolition Geography is about how and to what end people make freedom provisionally, imperatively, as they imagine home, against the disintegrating grind of partition and repartition through which racial capitalism perpetuates the means of its own valorization. That's a lot to take in. What she's basically talking about is how capitalism divides into private and private spaces. What I would argue is that there's this sort of element of the lady cab driver that is all about being able to navigate these spaces, and that an important part of abolition geography is actually to make the travel through spaces, not just your home, but the travel through those spaces, safe and equitable, and to be able to do so as yourself, as you see yourself, not as the government wants to tell you about the person that you can be. To me, I think that's an interesting conflict at the heart of this song, and I'm not here to say that Lady Cab Driver is definitely about sort of it doesn't have the same message as Free. But I think it's an important dose of realism, I'll put it that way. But it also makes me ask a lot of questions. So I'd love to talk more about it during the Q&A. Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you very much.